Smash like if you've got a strong stomach, subscribe if you want the stories they don't show in daylight, and drop a comment with the one prison you never want to hear your name connected to. Because tonight, the United States isn't a map, it's a maze of concrete cages. It begins the way these places often begin to break, without warning, and then all at once. In the early hours of February 2nd, 1980, at the Penitentiary of New Mexico near Santa Fe, the night air inside the blocks feels thick, stale, and overworked. Men who have learned to measure time by footsteps and key turns are suddenly moving faster than the building can contain. A door gives, a corridor floods, and the prison becomes a living thing, metal breathing, concrete sweating, sound ricocheting off cinder block. In moments, control is not something the institution holds, it's something that moves, hand to hand, tier to tier, carried by fear and opportunity. The riot that follows is later described as the most violent in U.S. history, lasting roughly 36 hours. By the end, 33 incarcerated men are dead, and more than 200 are treated for injuries. Inside that chaos, survival becomes a private math problem everyone solves differently. Some men run toward the noise, chasing a sudden chance to settle old debts or claim new power. Others press into corners, backs against cold walls, watching the tears like shorelines during a storm, waiting to see which way the wave will break. The prison's unwritten rules harden instantly. Who belongs where, who can move, who can speak, who must be silent. In the dim light, faces blur into roles: predator, target, ally, shadow. A mattress dragged across a doorway becomes a border, a torn sheet becomes a flag, and somewhere in the middle of it, the most dangerous thing isn't a weapon, it's certainty. The certainty that the system is gone for the night, and what replaces it is raw hierarchy. This is the first lesson of America's most dangerous prisons. The building is only the shell. The real machine is the pressure inside. Overcrowding, separation, deprivation, and the silent economies that form when people are locked together long enough. Across decades, different facilities become known for different kinds of danger, but the pattern repeats with eerie consistency. Some places are dangerous because they're old and packed tight, built for one era and forced to hold another. Some are dangerous because they concentrate men with nothing left to lose. Others are dangerous because they're designed to eliminate movement entirely, turning days into identical blocks of isolation until the mind begins to echo. Far from New Mexico, in the mountains of Colorado, ADX Florence sits like a conclusion. It is the federal supermax, built for confinement as a philosophy. Here, men can spend at least 23 hours a day alone in a cell, the world narrowed to concrete, steel, and a slot in the door. The danger is quieter, but not smaller, the slow violence of time with nowhere to go, the way isolation can grind a person down until the body is present, but the spirit is somewhere else. People call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies, but the nickname doesn't capture the silence, only the reputation. On the opposite end of that spectrum is a place like Pelican Bay State Prison in California, infamous for the security housing unit, long-term isolation, tied for years to suspected gang affiliation. By July 2013, that pressure surfaces in a different form, a hunger strike that spreads beyond a single prison into a statewide protest involving tens of thousands of incarcerated people. It begins at Pelican Bay and expands fast, driven by men who have spent years watching the same walls, demanding a change to how isolation is used. The danger here isn't one night of chaos, it's the long fuse of a system that can hold someone in limbo so long that refusing food becomes the loudest language left. But in the public imagination, danger is often defined by blood on the floor, not time in a box. That's why prisons like Attica Correctional Facility in New York still cast a shadow more than half a century later. In September 1971, a rebellion erupts and quickly becomes a national spectacle. Thousands of men inside, dozens of hostages taken, the yard transformed into a tense, improvised territory where demands for basic conditions collide with the hard edge of state power. Over 4 days, negotiations stall. Then, on September 13th, the retaking turns catastrophic. 43 people die, 33 incarcerated men, and 10 correctional officers and employees, most from gunfire during the assault. In the smoke and panic, the story that escapes first is the one that burns deepest. Early claims that hostages were murdered by inmates. Within a day, medical examiners confirmed that the hostages died from bullets fired by law enforcement, and the truth arrives too late to stop the lie from planting itself in the public mind. That is the second lesson of America's most dangerous prisons. What happens inside doesn't stay inside, but what reaches the outside is often warped, simplified, or weaponized. A riot becomes a headline, a lockdown becomes a statistic, a hunger strike becomes a talking point, and the people living it become silhouettes in a story someone else controls. In the years after Attica, the country builds new answers, new tactics, new units, new layers of security, trying to prevent another yard from becoming a battlefield. Yet each new solution creates its own kind of risk: isolation that can break the mind, classification systems that can brand a person permanently, and facilities that become pressure cookers where a single spark can still turn a night into history. Back in New Mexico in 1980, the 36 hours stretched like a lifetime. Men who entered the night thinking only about breakfast find themselves calculating whether they'll see morning at all. The prison's architecture, tiers, blind corners, narrow hallways doesn't just contain the violence, it shapes it, funnels it, amplifies it. The sounds are the only constant: running feet, metal striking metal, a roar rising and falling like weather. And when control finally returns, the building looks the same from the outside: gray, solid, unremarkable, while inside, everything has shifted. Because after a prison breaks once, it never truly goes back to how it was. The men who lived through it carry new maps in their heads: where the weak spots are, where the shadows gather, how fast order can vanish. The institution responds by tightening, separating, hardening. But the truth remains: danger doesn't come from one villain or one moment. It grows out of systems, histories, and choices, stacked year after year until a single night can collapse them. And the next prison on the list doesn't begin with a riot, it begins with a rumor. One sentence spoken outside the walls, repeated until it becomes fact. A lie that moves faster than any official correction. A story that once believed makes the next act of violence feel justified before it even happens. Because when Attica fell, what the world heard first wasn't the truth. It was the version that made everyone stop caring who the bullets actually hit.
The rumor that escaped Attica moved faster than any correction ever could. Outside the walls, the first version of the story hardened into a kind of permission slip. Permission to stop asking what really happened. Permission to accept a simple monster narrative. But inside prisons across the country, the men living behind steel understood a darker truth. Once the outside world decides you are less than human, the inside world becomes easier to brutalize, easier to ignore, easier to seal off. At Attica, it took less than a day for official autopsies to confirm the hostages were killed by bullets fired during the retaking, not by the sensational claims that spread first. The correction arrived, but it arrived after the damage, after the public imagination had already chosen what it wanted to believe. 4 days before Attica ended, a different kind of pressure had already been building on the West Coast. San Quentin, sitting on the edge of the San Francisco Bay, carried an old California weight: historical, famous, crowded with reputation. In August 1971, it became the stage for an event that still feels like a fever dream when replayed in hindsight: an attempted escape and riot tied to the death of George Jackson, a prominent incarcerated activist and co-founder of the Black Guerrilla family. The incident on August 21, 1971, led to 6 deaths, and afterward, 6 men, later known as the San Quentin Six, were charged in connection with what happened in the cell block during that chaos. The details remain disputed even decades later, but the outline is clear enough to shape an era. A weapon appears inside a maximum security unit, a prison becomes a battlefield in minutes, and the story that follows is fought not just in courtrooms and headlines, but in the long, quiet politics of prison yards. In the years that came after, California's prison system didn't just grow, it strained. When violence spiked in the 1970s and 1980s, it wasn't described as random, it was structured. Gangs formed hierarchies that outlasted transfers and lockdowns, and the state responded by building deeper layers of control: segregation units, secure housing, isolation blocks meant to sever influence. Folsom, with its hard angles and heavy history, became one of the places where that tension showed itself. In September 2012, a riot at California State Prison Sacramento, often referred to as New Folsom, sent a wave of people to hospitals with stab and slash wounds, while one person was shot and wounded during the response. The fight began late morning, fast and contagious, and from the outside, it looked like one more headline in a long list. From the inside, it felt like proof that no amount of concrete could erase the patterns men carried with them. Alliances, debts, rivalries, human systems built to survive in a place designed to break them. 3 years later, in August 2015, that same institution would again become the setting for a moment that snapped like a branch in dry air. Hugo Pinel, one of the men long associated with the San Quentin Six, was killed, and the killing triggered a riot that spread across an exercise yard, sending multiple people to outside hospitals with stab wounds. It wasn't just a death, it was a signal. In prisons, signals matter as much as sentences. Who can be touched, who can't, and what it means when someone crosses that line. After a signal like that, every movement on the yard becomes a calculation. Every glance becomes a question. Every normal routine becomes a thin sheet pulled tight over something violent underneath. But the documentary lens doesn't stay in California, because danger in American prisons isn't a regional accent, it's a national language, spoken differently depending on the building. In Colorado, the danger is engineered into silence. ADX Florence, the federal supermax, is built to make movement rare and contact rarer. Many incarcerated men there are held in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, their world reduced to a cell, a slot, and an hour that doesn't feel like freedom so much as controlled breathing space. In a place like that, danger doesn't always arrive as a riot. Sometimes it arrives as time itself, months that stack into years, days that repeat until identity blurs and the mind starts treating isolation like weather you can't escape. In California, the pressure of isolation eventually erupted not as violence, but as refusal. On July 8, 2013, a hunger strike began at Pelican Bay State Prison, led by men held in long-term solitary confinement in the SHU. The strike spread across the state, with reporting describing participation in the tens of thousands at its start, an enormous collective act inside a system designed to keep people separate. It was a different kind of danger, not the danger of a blade or a riot, but the danger of a system pushed so far into extremes that the only remaining protest was the body itself refusing the institution's most basic control: food, routine, compliance. Across the country, in South Carolina, the danger looks older, like overcrowding and staffing shortages turning a prison into a dry forest. On April 15, 2018, Lee Correctional Institution exploded into violence that left 7 incarcerated men dead and dozens injured. It began, according to later summaries, as a robbery inside the prison, an everyday crime in a place where people own almost nothing and still have everything to lose. Then it escalated into gang violence that the building could not contain. The night became a locked arena, and the men inside became trapped in a conflict that moved faster than any sense of safety could. And then the story jumps forward, because Most Dangerous isn't only a history lesson. In January 2026, in Washington State Prison in Georgia, a disturbance during visitation hours ended with 3 incarcerated men dead and a dozen more injured, according to reports. Visitation is supposed to be the closest thing to normal life, voices from the outside, a moment where people pretend the walls aren't permanent. When violence breaks out there, it's not just an incident, it's a collapse of the last fragile illusion that anything inside is truly contained. Across all of these places, the same patterns repeat like a refrain: pressure, scarcity, hierarchy, and the quiet economy of fear. Men adapt to survive. They join groups to avoid being alone. They learn which corners are safe and which ones belong to someone else. They learn the danger is not always announced. Sometimes it arrives as a locked door that should be open.
Sometimes it arrives as a rumor that turns one face into a target. Sometimes it arrives as a shift in policy that changes who sleeps where, who eats when, who steps on the yard first. By the end of this chapter, the list doesn't feel like a countdown anymore. It feels like a map of the same story told in 10 different dialects: riot, lockdown, isolation, protest, in sudden death under fluorescent light. And somewhere in the middle of that map is the thing that makes these prisons truly dangerous. Not simply what happens, but how easily what happens can disappear into bureaucracy, into distance, into the outside world's short attention span. Because in every one of these facilities, there is always a place that isn't meant to be looked at too closely. A corridor with no windows, a unit behind another unit, a door that stays locked even when the rest of the prison is awake. And when that locked door finally opens, what's waiting behind it won't be a single villain. It will be the system's most protected secret, hidden in plain sight, sealed behind concrete, and kept alive by everyone who benefits from silence.
On January 11, 2026, the most dangerous moment at Washington State Prison in Davisboro, Georgia, doesn't begin in a cell block at night. It begins in daylight, in the one place built to feel almost normal: visitation. The air carries the faint smell of disinfectant and warm bodies. Conversations sit low and careful, held between hands and plastic chairs, between people trying to act like the world outside still has a doorway into the world inside. For a few hours, names become first names again. Faces soften. Time pretends it can be ordinary. Then the ordinary breaks. It starts on a sidewalk near the visitation area, an altercation that snaps into motion so quickly it feels like a trapdoor opening beneath the room. A cluster forms, then another. Movement becomes a language, heads turning, chairs scraping, bodies shifting into defensive angles without anyone saying why. Men who know the rhythm of danger read it instantly. How fast others stand, how quickly space clears, the way a crowd creates cover for whatever is about to happen next. The room doesn't explode all at once, it fractures. The first wave is confusion, then urgency. The second wave is fear, because fear spreads faster than any shouting ever could. In the minutes that follow, multiple fights break out across the area. The violence isn't cinematic, it's chaotic and ugly in its speed. Too many people moving at once, too many angles to track, too many split-second choices that determine who gets trapped and who slips through a gap. Some people run, some freeze, some press themselves behind whatever barrier exists: tables, walls, corners, anything that creates a thin illusion of safety. The visiting families are shepherded out, hurried through exits as the last fragile connection to the outside world is pulled away for survival's sake. Later reports will say 3 incarcerated men are dead and 12 more are injured. The story becomes national because it happened in the open, during visitation, where the prison's danger touched the edge of the public. After the disturbance, the prison returns to its most familiar sound: doors sealing, locks clicking, silence rebuilding itself like a wall. Inside, the people who survive the first wave live through the second, the quiet aftermath where everyone tries to figure out what it meant. In prisons, meaning is never abstract. Meaning is currency. Meaning is warning. A violent day during visitation doesn't just mark bodies, it marks territory, status, and future risk. In the hours that follow, men replay the sequence like a film they can't stop watching. Who moved first? Who hesitated? Who disappeared into the crowd? Who came back injured? Who didn't come back at all? Even when the building feels still, it isn't calm. It is calculating. And Washington State Prison is not an exception. It's the newest chapter in a pattern that's old enough to have its own mythology. Across America, the most dangerous prisons are often presented like a list: 10 names, 10 places, 10 explanations. But danger doesn't respect lists. It travels through systems. It moves through overcrowded dorms and narrow tiers, through shortages and stress, through the long pressure that builds when men are forced to live inside hierarchies that never sleep. In 2018, at Lee Correctional Institution in Bishopville, South Carolina,
That pressure becomes a night of mass violence. It begins as a robbery inside the prison and grows into hours-long gang conflict. By morning, 7 incarcerated men are dead and more than 20 require hospital care. The building doesn't have to be the newest or the strictest to become lethal. It only has to be stretched thin enough that one spark can catch everything. Sometimes the spark isn't a fight. Sometimes it's the slow burning certainty that the walls are closing in forever. In California, men held in long-term solitary confinement at Pelican Bay's security housing unit reached a point where violence wasn't the tool, they chose absence. On July 8, 2013, a hunger strike begins there and rapidly spreads. At its height, participation is reported in the tens of thousands, one of the largest mass prisoner hunger strikes in U.S. history. In the moment, the danger isn't a riot, it's what drives people to use their bodies as their last message. It's the quiet desperation that makes starvation feel like the only remaining leverage. Then there are the places where danger is engineered into the architecture itself. At ADX Florence in Colorado, control is the point. Men can spend at least 23 hours a day alone in cells built to reduce movement, reduce contact, reduce everything down to a repeatable routine. It's a prison designed to prevent a riot by making gathering nearly impossible. But preventing one kind of danger doesn't erase the other. The human mind isn't a machine made to run in perfect isolation. The days there stack into years, and the danger becomes quieter, internal, slow, an erosion that doesn't make headlines because it doesn't happen all at once. And yet, even here, the public keeps asking for a list, a countdown. 10 places to fear, 10 places to point at, 10 places that explain why the system is what it is. The truth is, the list exists because it's easier than the map. A list makes danger feel contained. It makes it feel like something that can be ranked and boxed and labeled, like a documentary thumbnail with bold text in a shadowy corridor. But the people living inside the system don't experience it as a list. They experience it as a climate, sometimes scorching, sometimes freezing, sometimes deceptively still. They experience it through routine that can turn violent without warning, through whispers that can become targets overnight, through the fragile social contracts that form between men who know the rules are written in consequences. In Washington State Prison, the violence during visitation carries a specific kind of sting because visitation is supposed to be the safety valve. It is supposed to be the moment when the prison remembers it's holding people who still belong to someone. When violence intrudes there, it sends a message that nothing is protected, not family time, not public-facing spaces, not the one room where men try to look like themselves again. And that message echoes backwards through history. In 1971, at Attica in New York, the world watched a prison become a national wound. The rebellion lasted days. When it ended, 43 people were dead. 33 incarcerated men, and 10 correctional officers and employees. For a time, the public believed the wrong story about how some of those deaths happened. The correction came later. The damage had already spread. Attica became a symbol not only of prison violence, but of how quickly truth can be swallowed by a narrative that feels easier to digest. And in 1980, at the Penitentiary of New Mexico, the building fell into a 36-hour nightmare, still remembered as one of the deadliest prison riots in U.S. history. 33 incarcerated men died, more than 200 were treated for injuries. In the aftermath, the lesson was brutal. When control collapses, it doesn't return gently. It returns heavier. It returns with new rules, new restrictions, new layers of steel meant to ensure the building never breaks that way again. But steel can't remove the pressure that created the break in the first place. This is the hidden spine of the Top 10 story. Not that 10 prisons are uniquely evil, but that each one is a warning about what happens when human beings are stacked under stress and sealed behind walls the public rarely sees. By the end of January 11, 2026, the public headline is simple: a disturbance, 3 dead, a dozen injured. But inside the walls, it isn't simple at all. Inside, the day becomes a new reference point, a date that will be spoken in half sentences, a day that changes who trusts whom, a moment that rearranges the invisible map of safety in a place where safety is never guaranteed. And somewhere, long after the visiting room empties and the doors seal again, there are men sitting alone on bunks, staring at concrete, replaying how fast normal turned into terror, knowing the outside world will move on before the inside ever can. Because the most dangerous thing about these prisons isn't just what they can do to a body, it's what they can do to time. They make a single afternoon last forever. If you thought this one was wild, the next story is even darker. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and comment the one prison you want us to break down next.